talking about objects and elements that occupy domestic interior spaces. So I'm looking at furniture, I'm looking at curtains, I'm looking at vases, just like the little knick-knacky objects that kind of occupy the places that we live. And for this particular body of work, I was influenced by 17th century genre painting, Dutch genre painting. And in those paintings, they're conveying these scenes of people acting out these domestic scenes like sewing or reading letters or just sitting and talking with one another. And I wasn't so much interested in like the acts that they were doing as much as I was the actual spaces. And in those spaces, you're going to see a lot of doorways that are framing what's happening, as well as like a swag of curtain that's going to also frame that scene. And I was looking at a lot of the textiles, like tapestries that were hanging on the walls, and as well as the floors, so like wood parquet flooring and marble flooring. And I was really focusing on the geometric structuring of those paintings. So in my work, you're going to see a lot of squares and triangles. So really utilizing those geometric shapes to make my compositions. I want to talk a little bit about the materials I used. I knew for this particular body of work, I wanted to use household materials like flooring or carpet or upholstery. So I called around a bunch of architect companies and interior designers, and I was asking them for donations of samples that they weren't using anymore, and I got a ton of stuff. I got a ton of all these little tiles and just these little swatches of upholstery, and I knew that those were the materials I wanted to use to make this work. So each composition isn't necessarily referencing something directly, but I'm taking elements from these paintings to make my compositions. So I would start out each piece with a sketch utilizing one of those elements, whether it's the marble flooring or the curtains. So I would start out with that, and each piece kind of went through its own process of, I would start with one composition and I would start to sew them, and then it'd be like, okay, this doesn't look quite right, so I'm gonna take it apart, and I would restructure it. And I like that idea of restructuring and taking things apart and ripping it, because it really gets into the process of sewing and that kind of domestic craft, which you would also see like happening in the paintings. So I was really interested in that. Each piece is kind of talking about something completely different that I would see in some of the paintings. So for this piece in particular, I was looking at vases that I would see in these paintings. It's called Dutch Delftware, and that was inspired by white and blue porcelain from Asia. So I was like really interested in that idea of bringing influences from other countries that were being depicted in these paintings. So you'll see some Middle Eastern and Eastern influence in a lot of these, and you'll definitely see European. I was also looking at this artist who did wallpaper design. His name was William Morris. And the way wallpaper design came about was actually from textiles. So textiles were being imported from the Middle East, but they were so expensive to produce that they didn't want to use them on the floor, so they were using them on the walls as wall coverings. And since that was expensive, they started to print wallpaper. So I liked that idea of how you're using wallpaper to kind of imitate a textile, which a textile is being used to cover the wall, but you would typically see like a rug on the floor. So I was kind of interested in these places where things were not where they should be, or where you think they should be. So, I'm trying to think. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm curious about what spurred your interest in like interior spaces in general.
Interior spaces?
Yeah.
I guess I didn't really like make the connection to why I was interested in that until like later in school. And that stemmed really from like my growing up. My grandma was constantly redecorating her house, and I didn't really make that connection until I got to my senior thesis show, and I was thinking about the function of furniture and why we use the things the way we do. And for that body of work, I actually wanted to take everything apart. I was like, in order to understand why this is made the way it is, I want to take it apart. And that relating back to like my grandmother always constantly redecorating, I was thinking about, well, what is the value that we're placing on these things that we put into our house, and why are we constantly redecorating and things like that.
So do you think of them as paintings?
I don't think of them as paintings, and I don't really think of them as images either. I think of them more like objects because I physically manipulate the material. I'm not just like applying something to paper. But I wanted them to be displayed like paintings because I was influenced by painting and I was talking about painting within the works. So I'll leave it up to the viewer to decide what they are. But I think of them more like an object, like a sculpture.
What about the scale of the pieces?
Yeah, you had mentioned this earlier. So
Yeah.
scale, I was definitely thinking about scale. So those samples I got were like these 2" by 2" little squares that would have like a different finish on them. And I liked that idea of like it's this small little moment that you're looking at and you're having to compare it to another small moment. So I was thinking of the scale of these as being small enough to where you can take everything in one glance as you're looking directly in front of it. And so I didn't want the size to get too big, and I didn't want it to be quite too small. You'll also see like these floor tiles are exactly 12 inches by 12 inches. So I was conscious of that when I was determining what size I wanted these to be.
Who else has a question? Someone's got a question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like how the use of, I know in some of these you're using like vinyl or like plastics and things like that, and how that relates back to the kind of like richness of the subject matter or the original subject matter?
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk about this piece specifically, but in a lot of those paintings, they use a lot of geometric compositions for the flooring, whether it was like intricate wood parquet or marble. And so when I got those samples, I was like, I know I want to reference those parts of the paintings. And so when I got this laminate, they're really weird. They're like super thin. They're like 1/8 of an inch thin, and it's masonite, and then it's this thin layer of laminate, and you can't cut it by hand. So I got to use a laser cutter and like experiment with that, so I could really make like the designs I wanted and get perfect squares. And I wanted to kind of make my own faux finish marble flooring. And then I did the same thing with the wood parquet piece. So I answered
Yeah,
that
it's
question.
a very like 21st century
Tool.
way of making like these sort of classic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I attempted to try and cut them by hand, but it was just, it would break and it would get like this really ugly jagged edge, and I was like, I need these to be very clean and pristine.
I really like the pieces that the work wraps around the edge, because it does feel like an object rather than just a flat surface. So, and then like they kind of look like pillows to me because they're like soft objects around the same size too. So I think it's interesting.
Yeah, so like decorative pillows are something that I wasn't looking at specifically in these paintings, but that definitely kind of becomes part of the umbrella of my work, talking about like domestic objects and things that we would use to decorate our home and you would see on interiors. Something that would most likely be overlooked, but I'm kind of like drawn to those weird like why do we want these in our house? Why do I need this throw pillow there?
Yeah.
It's just kind of, it's interesting to me.
Any other questions?